Welcome to the Deep Dive, part of the Generative AI podcast series, where we try to make sense of the just overwhelming flood of new AI research. We cut through the noise to bring you the key ideas.
And today we're diving into something that really pushes back against a dominant idea in AI right now, which is basically that bigger is always better. For the past few years, it's all been about large language models, LLMs, these huge, sprawling models.
Yeah, absolutely. Billions, even trillions of parameters. And they're fantastic for certain things, like, generating text, summarizing articles.
Right, they're everywhere.
But when you ask them to do something that requires really deep, step-by-step, almost algorithmic thinking, solving a genuinely hard Sudoku puzzle, or finding the best path through a complex maze like a 30 by 30 grid, or even just basic inductive logic puzzles, they often just hit a wall.
It's true. And it turns out that their massive size might actually be hiding a fundamental architectural weakness. They're surprisingly shallow in their reasoning capabilities.
That sounds like a paradox, doesn't it? Deep learning models that are shallow.
It is. It's the paradox of scale. You can stack hundreds of these transformer layers, but the underlying computational mechanism, well, it stays kind of constrained. The system gets incredibly wide, but it struggles to achieve what we might call effective depth over time.
So that's where our focus comes in today. We're looking at the Hierarchical Reasoning Model, or HRM. It's a really novel, recurrent architecture, and it's explicitly inspired by how our own brains seem to handle complex, multi-step thinking.
Exactly. And our mission really is to unpack the specific technical details, the innovations that let this model, which is tiny by today's standards, only 27 million parameters, that's almost nothing, achieve, well, near-perfect results on these tricky reasoning tasks where models thousands of times bigger just completely fail.
Okay, so let's set up that core contrast right away. The current state-of-the-art for reasoning often uses something called chain of thought, or CoT, and that needs huge amounts of data, generates tons of text tokens.
Right, that spells everything out.
But HRM, it solves these really complex symbolic problems using maybe only about 1,000 training examples for each task. It's trained totally from scratch, no pre-training needed. And crucially, it doesn't generate all that step-by-step language. It does its reasoning internally, latently, silently, you could say.
And efficiently. That's the key. So we're going to lay out the blueprint for how it pulls this off. We'll look at the architecture, which is, as you said, brain-inspired. We'll examine this really clever gradient method it uses to get around old memory problems. And we'll even see how its internal structure kind of spontaneously organizes itself in a way that mirrors the brain's own cortex.
All right, let's start with that central problem then. Section 1. The AI reasoning paradox. You called it the shallowness problem. We hear deep learning constantly, but you're saying the main architecture, the transformer, isn't actually deep enough for this kind of algorithmic thinking.
That's exactly right. I mean, despite having maybe hundreds of layers, the standard transformer has a fixed computational depth, at least in a theoretical sense. And this fixed depth really limits the kinds of computations it can perform efficiently. It puts it into these quite restrictive computational complexity classes.
You mentioned AC dollars and TC dollars in the paper. Now, for listeners who aren't complexity theorists, what does that practically mean? Why is being stuck in the AC dollar or TC dollar R club such a big deal?
Yeah, it's quite restrictive. Basically, these classes define how information can be processed within a fixed number of steps. So a model stuck in AC dollar or TC dollars, well, it has a very limited capacity to handle non-local information. It really struggles with tasks that need things like, say, accurately counting elements or comparing things that are far apart in the input sequence, or, and this is critical, doing deliberate sequential planning.
Okay, so something like Sudoku, where you have to constantly check the row, the column, the 3 by 3 block, track all these symbolic constraints at the same time.
Yeah.
That involves looking back and forth, right? That sounds like the kind of polynomial time reasoning these architectures just aren't suited for.
Precisely. You just can't achieve, true complete algorithmic reasoning if your computational depth is fundamentally fixed like that. You can make the model wider, bigger matrices, more parameters, or even stack more layers, but you still hit this performance ceiling on these hard reasoning tasks. The architecture itself imposes that limit.
Right. So if the transformer is structurally shallow, how have LLMs managed to give us this impression of deep reasoning, especially over the last few years? They seem pretty good sometimes.
Well, that's where the chain of thought CDD crutch comes in.
Yeah.
CoT is actually quite ingenious in a way. It basically takes the hard reasoning problem and pushes it outside the model. It forces the shallow model to generate step-by-step language, literally talking itself through the logic, breaking the big task down into smaller chunks that it can handle.
So it's using its own output like a scratchpad, writing down the steps instead of just computing the answer internally. But you called it a crutch. What happens when you give it something really tough, like that Sudoku extreme task?
Yeah, that's where the limitations really show. First off, high on T is incredibly brittle. If the model makes just one tiny logical error in that sequence of thought tokens it generates,
The whole thing derails.
exactly, the whole chain breaks, and the final answer is almost certainly wrong. And because it's tied to explicit language, it needs tons of training data, often human-written reasoning steps. And maybe the biggest practical issue, it's slow, really high latency, because it has to generate potentially hundreds of tokens just for the thinking process before it even gets to the answer. It's computationally very expensive.
Okay, that paints a clear picture. It seems like we need to move beyond language as the only way for these models to think. We need them to think internally, silently, maybe more like how we perceive our own minds working. Which brings us nicely to HRM's core idea, latent reasoning.
Latent reasoning, yeah. It just means the computation happens entirely within the model's internal hidden states. This is where that neuroscience connection feels strongest, right? Language is mainly how we communicate thoughts, but our brains seem capable of long, complex chains of reasoning internally in this efficient latent space without necessarily verbalizing every single step.
That sounds a lot like what the original recurrent neural networks, RNNs, were aiming for back in the 90s and 2000s, but they kind of fizzled out, didn't they? They didn't quite conquer the world like transformers did.
They did hit major roadblocks. Two big related problems, really. First, the infamous vanishing gradient problem. When you tried to make them deep by stacking layers or unrolling them over many time steps, the learning signal just died out. The system stalled.
Right, the gradients got too small to update the early layers effectively.
Exactly. And second, the huge memory costs associated with the standard training method, which is backpropagation through time, or BPTT.
Okay, so the big challenge for HRM is to achieve this effective computational depth, letting the model run thousands of internal reasoning steps, but without vanishing gradients making it stall, and without BPTT eating up all the GPU memory.
That's the core challenge it had to overcome.
So if the classic artificial recurrent approaches didn't quite cut it, the HRM researchers looked elsewhere. To the one system we know can do deep reasoning, the brain. You said HRM is explicitly inspired by how the mammalian brain tackles this.
Yes, and the brain's solution seems to be hierarchy. HRM adopts three key principles from neuroscience to get that depth and efficiency.
Okay, what's the first principle?
Hierarchical processing. The brain doesn't try to solve everything at once with one giant network. It separates tasks. You have higher-level areas like the prefrontal cortex acting as planners, integrating information over longer periods for abstract thought. They set the strategy.
The big picture thinkers.
Right. And then you have lower-level areas, maybe closer to sensory input or motor output, handling the rapid, detailed execution of those plans. They're the specialists. This division of labor means the system can handle complexity without being overwhelmed.
Makes sense. And the second principle, you mentioned temporal separation.
Yeah, this links directly to things like brain waves, neural oscillations. Different levels in this brain hierarchy operate at naturally different speeds or timescales. Think of slow waves like theta, around 4 to 8 hertz, often associated with planning and memory, versus much faster gamma waves, 100 hertz, involved in rapid local processing.
So different clock speeds for different jobs.
Kind of. And this temporal separation is vital. It means the slow, stable, high-level plan, the theta rhythm, maybe provides a consistent context for the fast, detailed, low-level actions, the gamma rhythm, without the fast actions immediately disrupting the slow plan.
So the quick, detailed work doesn't constantly derail the overall strategy. That seems really important for stability.
It's crucial. And the third principle is recurrent connectivity. Recurrence is what lets computation unfold over time, giving you that depth without needing an equally deep physical stack of layers. And critically, the brain seems to manage this iterative refinement, this learning over time, without needing some kind of global memory bank to replay every single step for credit assignment, essentially. It avoids the massive cost of BPTT.
Okay, so that blueprint, a slow, abstract planner, guiding a fast, specialized executor, operating at different speeds, and connected recurrently that directly leads to HRM's design.
Precisely. It's a dual module system based on these principles.
All right, let's get into the technical details then. Section 3, the HRM architecture. You said it's a dual engine system. What are the core components? Can you walk us through them?
Sure. There are 4 main learnable parts. First, you have an input network. Let's call it $5. Its job is just to take the raw input, $6, and project it into a useful internal format.
Like an embedding layer.
Pretty much, yeah. Then come the two stars of the show. The low-level executor module, $5, doing the fast detailed work, and the high-level planner module, 5H2, handling the slow abstract thinking. And finally, there's an output network, $5, which takes the final state from the high-level planner and produces the actual prediction.
Okay. Input, executor, planner, output. How do they actually interact during a calculation? This is where the hierarchy and time separation come in, right?
Exactly. The whole process unfolds over, say, 20 high-level cycles. And within each of those dollar cycles, the low-level module runs for $2 time steps. So the total number of computational steps is dollars times $2.
N cycles of the slow planner, T steps of the fast executor within each cycle. Got it. And the updates reflect that brain rhythm idea.
Precisely. The low-level update for its state $$ happens at every single time step, let's say step I$. It calculates its new state based on its own previous state, the current input representation tilde-bore, and crucially, the current fixed state of the high-level planner. So it's working fast under the stable guidance of the current plan.
The worker bee taking direction.
Yeah. Then the high-level update for its state $0 only happens once per cycle, specifically right at the end of the T low-level steps. When $2 is a multiple of $2, it takes the final state that the L module reached during that cycle and uses that to update its own more abstract state.
So the planner only reconsiders its strategy after the executor has completed a whole chunk of work. That keeps the plan stable while the details are worked out.
Exactly. The high-level state provides that stable context, while the low-level state churns through the details. It stops the high-level view getting swamped by noise or rapid fluctuations.
Okay, now for the really deep dive part. The paper mentions how these modules for LLM filter boxers are actually built. They use transformer blocks.
Yes, they do. Both Phylon and Fockles are implemented using standard encoder-only transformer blocks. And importantly, they use the same architecture and dimensions for both modules.
Wait, so they're using transformer blocks but recurrently, not in the usual fixed stack like in GPT.
That's the key architectural insight. They take the powerful computational engine of the transformer block, its ability to mix information effectively using attention, but they apply it iteratively over time. This overcomes the fixed depth limitation of standard transformers while keeping the representational power.
How do they combine the different inputs for these blocks, like the previous state, the planner state, the input?
It's actually very straightforward, just simple element-wise addition. It keeps the architecture clean and avoids unnecessary complexity.
And the paper mentions borrowing enhancements from modern LLMs, specifically the Llama architecture, things like RMS norm, rotary positional encoding. Why are those particular choices important here, especially in a recurrent setting?
Well, stability becomes absolutely critical when you're applying the same function potentially thousands of times. Any tiny instability in the calculations of the radians will just blow up exponentially over that many steps. So these choices are all about ensuring stability.
Okay, break them down for us. Rope E.
Rotary positional encoding, ROPE, is essential for any transformer dealing with sequences to give it a sense of order. Here, since the model is effectively unrolling over time, knowing the position in that temporal sequence is crucial.
GLU.
Gated linear units, GLU, are often found to provide better nonlinear activation functions in transformers compared to standard ReLU, leading to better performance.
And RMS norm, you emphasize stability.
Yes, RMS norm, root mean square normalization, is key. It normalizes activations based on their magnitude or energy, and it's known to be very effective at stabilizing training, especially in deep networks, or in this case, deeply recurrent ones. It prevents activations from exploding or vanishing.
What about the post-norm setup?
Post-norm, where the normalization layer comes after the attention and feed-forward operations, is another choice often seen in Llama-style models. It's generally found to provide better stability for very deep training compared to the older pre-norm setup.
And they also mention removing bias terms and using a specific initialization, truncated LeCun normal. Those sound like very fine-grained details.
They are, but they matter for recurrent stability. Removing bias terms can help prevent small, systematic shifts from accumulating over many iterations. And LeCun normal initialization is often paired with RMS norm because it helps maintain appropriate signal variance throughout the network during training. Basically, every single one of these technical choices is geared towards creating an environment where the computation can repeat deeply and reliably without falling over.
Okay, that makes sense. Building a stable foundation for deep recurrence. Now let's get to the really big innovations that made this work, where older RNNs struggled. We need to solve those two classic problems. the computation stalling, and the memory cost exploding.
Exactly. Those are the hurdles HRM clears.
So, Section 4A, hierarchical convergence, tackling that RNN stalling problem first.
Right. The classic issue with standard RNNs is that they tend to converge too quickly. As the network iterates, the changes to the hidden state, the updates, they get smaller and smaller. The system settles into a fixed point, an equilibrium, but often it's a local one, not the globally optimal solution. The computation just stalls.
So the model finds an answer, but maybe not the right answer, and then just stops trying, stops thinking.
Pretty much, yeah. It becomes inert because the internal updates have vanished. HRM solution is hierarchical convergence. Remember the two modules. The L module runs for its T steps, guided by the fixed H state. During these T steps, the L module is allowed to converge towards a local equilibrium. It effectively solves a subproblem.
Okay, but how does that stop the whole system stalling?
Because then the H module wakes up. It takes the final state of the converged L module and uses it to update itself. And this update to the high-level state acts like a computational reset for the low-level module.
Like wiping the slate clean for the executor.
Exactly, but in a structured way. It establishes a new, different context, a new plan for the L module. So in the next cycle of T steps, the L module starts converging again, but towards a different local equilibrium dictated by the updated H state.
I see. So instead of one long convergence to potentially the wrong answer, it's a sequence of shorter convergences, each one refining the solution based on the updated plan.
Precisely. If you look at the visualizations in the paper, Figure 3, the update magnitudes in a standard RNN just decay rapidly towards zero. But in HRM, the L module's update magnitude spikes back up at the start of every high-level cycle. It shows the computation stays active, stays alive over thousands of steps. It achieves depth through these nested, stable computations.
Okay, that tackles the stalling. Now for the second beast, memory. Section 4B, approximate gradient, bitching BPTT. Remind us why backpropagation through time is such a memory hog.
Right, BPTT is the standard way to train recurrent networks. But to calculate the gradients correctly, it needs to store every single intermediate hidden state from the entire forward pass. All of that was the node down right up to 0 and 10.
Yeah. So if you run it for 1,000 steps, you store 1,000 hidden states.
Exactly. Which means the memory requirement scales linearly with the number of steps. It severely limits how long you can run the model for or how many examples you can process in parallel, the batch size, because you just run out of GPU memory. It's a massive bottleneck.
You used the metaphor before. It's like having to store every frame of a long movie just to figure out how to adjust the acting in the first scene.
That's a great way to think about it. And biologically, it seems very implausible the brain does anything like that. So HRM uses a different approach, a one-step gradient approximation. And the amazing thing is, this reduces the memory footprint during backpropagation to overlong constant memory, completely independent of the number of steps other times t.
Constant memory. How is that even possible? It sounds like magic, or like it must be losing crucial information for learning.
It's not magic, it's clever maths. It builds on theoretical work from deep equilibrium models, or DEQs, and specifically uses the implicit function theorem, IFT. The core idea is that if the recurrent process converges to a stable fixed point, like cursor H for the H module, you can calculate the gradient with respect to that fixed point without explicitly unrolling the entire computation path that led to it.
Okay, but how does that avoid the BPTT cost? Doesn't calculating that implicit gradient still involve complex operations?
The exact calculation using IFT, that's equation 1 in the paper, is actually still very expensive. It involves calculating and then inverting a big matrix related to the Jacobian of the recurrent function, specifically AIJF dollars. Computing the Jacobian JF doi, and especially inverting AIJF doi, is computationally infeasible for large networks.
Right. Calculating all those partial derivatives and inverting the matrix sounds like a nightmare.
It is. So HRM makes a crucial simplification. It uses the one-step gradient approximation. This essentially assumes that the complex inverse matrix, AJF-1, can be approximated by just IDA dollars, the identity matrix. It's like saying the immediate last step of the update is the most important part for the gradient, and we can ignore the more complex higher-order interactions captured by the full Jacobian inverse.
So it's assuming the dynamics near the fixed point are relatively simple for the gradient calculation. What does that do to the actual gradient path during backpropagation?
It drastically shortens it. Instead of tracing the gradient back through all neo times TB steps, the path becomes super simple. From the output network, back to the final H state, back to the final L state from the last cycle, and then back to the input network parameters. That's it.
Wow.
This gives you those simplified gradient equations, equations 2 and 3 in the paper. For example, the gradient with respect to the H module parameters, BPTT, is approximated using only the derivative of the last H module update function, a partial, H partial applied at the final state. You don't need the history.
So you only need to know how the very last step influenced the state to estimate the gradient for the parameters. That explains the constant memory.
Exactly. Over $1 memory,
Yeah.
regardless of how many steps order times t you've run for. And intriguingly, this approximation aligns really well with the idea that learning or credit assignment in the brain's cortex seems to rely on local, short-range mechanisms, not some kind of global replay of past activity like BPTT. It's the key that unlocks truly deep, recurrent computation on current hardware.
Incredible. Okay, so they've solved stability with hierarchical convergence and memory with the approximate gradient. How do they actually train this thing and control its computation time? Section 5, dynamic control and training. Let's start with deep supervision.
Right, so deep supervision here is partly inspired by the idea of neural oscillations, maybe gating learning in the brain. Instead of just running the model for the full mod mul times t steps and calculating one loss at the very end, they break the forward pass into multiple segments, let's say long segments. And a loss is calculated at the end of each segment.
So you get more frequent feedback during the reasoning process.
Yes, and crucially, there's a detachment step. After you calculate the loss for segment dollars, the hidden state Z dollars that you pass forward to start the next segment, Mahler plus dollars, is detached from the computation graph.
Detached, meaning gradients don't flow back past that point.
Exactly. Gradients only flow back within the current segment. This acts as a strong regularizer, preventing overly long backpropagation paths, even with the approximate gradient, and it reinforces that Omenauer memory property. It gives frequent, localized learning signals.
Okay, that makes sense for training stability. Now, what about controlling how long the model thinks? That brings us to adaptive computational time, ACT. You mentioned the Kahneman System 1 versus System 2 idea.
Yeah, the analogy is that our brains don't just grind away indefinitely on a problem. We seem to dynamically allocate effort, quick, intuitive System 1 for easy stuff, and slow, deliberate System 2 when needed. HRM tries to replicate this using its deep supervision framework combined with reinforcement learning, specifically Q learning.
So the model learns when it should stop thinking. How does that work?
It has an extra little network called a Q-head. This Q-head looks at the final state of the high-level planner at the end of each segment, and it predicts two values. The expected future reward, or negative loss, if it chooses to halt now, and the expected reward if it chooses to continue for another segment. And it just compares the Q values. Pretty much. It halts if the predicted value for halting is higher than the value for continuing. There's usually also a minimum number of segments. It has to run so it doesn't give up too early, and a hard maximum maxers.
And how does it learn to make good halting decisions?
The Q-head is trained alongside the main model. The overall loss function, LMACT, includes not just the task prediction loss, like getting the Sudoku right, but also a loss term, binary cross entropy, that encourages the Q-head to accurately predict whether halting at segment dollar would lead to a better final outcome than continuing. So it learns both to solve the task and to stop efficiently.
That sounds incredibly efficient. It only uses compute cycles when the Q-head thinks it's beneficial, unlike CoT, which might generate a fixed long chain of thought regardless.
Exactly. The efficiency gains are huge. The paper shows that HRM with ACT often achieves similar accuracy to a version running a fixed large number of segments, but using way fewer segments on average. For example, on those tough Sudoku puzzles, it might match the performance of a model forced to run one M28 segments, while only needing an average of maybe M22 segments.
2 segments. To solve an extreme Sudoku. Wow, you can almost imagine this AI looking at a big LLM churning out CoT tokens and thinking, whoa, maybe like a Cylon from Battlestar Galactica. Generating hundreds of intermediate linguistic tokens, analyzing the input repeatedly. That's computationally wasteful, highly illogical. We have optimized away such inefficiency.
It really does feel like that level of optimization. The intelligence isn't in the verbosity, it's in the internal efficiency, how few cycles it takes to provably reach the right answer.
Okay, let's talk about those answers. Section 6. Stunning results. This is where we see if this elegant structure actually beats brute force scale. Remind us of the comparison. 27 million parameters, trained on maybe 1,000 examples per task versus giant models.
Right, the scale difference is immense. Let's start with the really hard algorithmic benchmark, Sudoku Extreme, 9 by 9. These aren't your newspaper puzzles. They require serious search, backtracking. The dataset they used was specifically chosen for difficulty, needing an average of 22 backtracks per puzzle.
And how did HRM do compared to the big CoT models?
HRM achieved near-perfect accuracy between 95% and 100% depending on the exact setup. The comparison. State-of-the-art CoT methods, even large ones fine-tuned for reasoning, completely failed. 0.0% accuracy.
0%. That's stark. That really highlights the architectural limitation we talked about, that ACTC dollar ceiling. CoT just couldn't handle that depth of symbolic reasoning.
It couldn't. The explicit language steps weren't enough to manage the complexity and necessary backtracking.
What about spatial reasoning? The maze task.
On Maze Hard, 30 by 30, finding the single optimal path, HRM got 74.5% accuracy. Baseline models, including standard transformers even up to 175 million parameters, struggled significantly, staying below 20% accuracy. Again, it's that need for deliberate long-horizon planning and self-correction that HRM structure provides.
And then the ultimate test, perhaps, of abstract reasoning, the ARC-AGI2 challenge. This is about inducing rules from examples, right?
Correct.
Fluid intelligence.
Exactly. RCAGI2 tests things like compositional reasoning, abstracting patterns. And here, HRM, despite being tiny and having a small input grid size, 30 by 30, achieved 40.3% accuracy. Now, compare that to leading CoT models mentioned in their comparison like O3 Mini High at 34.5%, or even a powerful model like Claude 3.7 cited at 21.2% on a related version. This little HRM, trained only on the official ARC data, shows genuinely better generalization on this task.
That's a powerful result. It really suggests that the way the model thinks, its structure, might be more important for generalization than just the sheer amount of data or parameters.
And that structure gives another cool benefit: inference time scaling. Because the computation happens over these recurrent steps, or segments, you can actually make the model think harder at test time, simply by letting it run for more segments than it was trained on.
Without any retraining.
Without any retraining. So if it encounters a really tough Sudoku during inference, you can just increase small max, allow it more computation time, and its accuracy often improves significantly. They showed this clearly. Training with a max is adept, but testing with MAMAX $16 boosted performance, especially on planning tasks. That ability to dynamically allocate more thought is a big advantage.
Fascinating. And since the reasoning is latent, hidden inside, how did they figure out how it was solving these problems? They looked at intermediate predictions.
Yes. By visualizing the model's predictions at the end of each segment $, they could get glimpses into its strategy. And it wasn't just memorizing, it learned actual algorithms. For the maze, it looked like it started exploring multiple paths simultaneously, then iteratively pruned bad paths and refined the good ones.
And for Sudoku, did it learn backtracking?
It absolutely seemed to. The pattern of filled cells resembled a depth-first search strategy, including evidence of backtracking, erasing a wrong guess, and trying another path. That's something standard feed-forward LLMs really struggle with implicitly. For ARC, the progression looked more like iterative refinement, maybe akin to hill climbing, making small adjustments segment by segment. It's discovering and running complex procedures internally.
Amazing. Okay, this leads perfectly into the final section. Section 7, the emergent brain. Validating the biological inspiration by looking inside the trained model. There's this idea from neuroscience about the dimensionality of representations.
Yes, a key concept from systems neuroscience is that the functional role of a brain area seems related to the dimensionality of its neural activity patterns. Higher-order areas like our prefrontal cortex involved in planning and flexible cognition tend to operate in higher dimensional spaces. This allows them to represent more complex relationships and adapt more flexibly. Lower-level sensory or motor areas might use lower-dimensional, more specialized representations.
So higher dimension means more capacity for complexity and flexibility. How do you measure that in an AI model?
They used a standard measure from neuroscience called the participation ratio, or PR. Intuitively, PR tells you how spread out the activity is across the available neural dimensions. If PR is low, most of the variance, most of the signal, is confined to just a few dimensions. It's a specialized compact code. If PR is high, the variance is distributed across many dimensions. It's a high-capacity, flexible code, good for juggling complex ideas.
So the hypothesis would be, if HRM is really mimicking brain hierarchy, the high-level planner should develop a higher PR, a higher dimensionality than the low-level executor. Did they find that?
They did, and the results were remarkably clear. After training, the low-level executor module had a participation ratio of about 30.22. The high-level planner module, however, had a PR of 89.95.
Wow, that's almost 3 times higher. The planning space is significantly more complex, higher dimensional than the execution space.
Exactly. That ratio of roughly 2.98 in HRM is strikingly similar to the kind of ratios observed between high-level association cortex and lower-level sensory motor areas in the mouse brain, which is around 2.25 in some studies. It suggests the model autonomously learned this fundamental organizational principle for efficient thinking.
But wait, you said earlier the 5LAR and 5MAR modules use the same transformer block architecture. Could this difference in dimensionality just be some weird artifact of the setup rather than something learned?
That's the critical control experiment they ran. They took an untrained HRM with random initial weights and measured the PR for CCAR6 and CAPRs. In the untrained network, the PR values were low and, importantly, almost identical for both modules.
Ah, so the difference only appears after training.
Precisely. This significant separation in dimensionality, the high-dimensional planner emerging distinct from the lower-dimensional executor, is a learned property. It's not baked into the architecture itself. It emerges as the model learns to solve these complex reasoning tasks recurrently.
That's really significant. It implies HRM avoids that phenomenon called neural collapse, where deep networks sometimes learn representations that flatten out into an unnecessarily low-dimensional space. Instead, HRM actually fosters this high-dimensional structure needed for cognitive flexibility, much like we think the prefrontal cortex does.
Exactly. By learning to partition its internal representations this way, HRM provides strong evidence that hierarchical organization, inspired by the brain, might be a more effective path to general, robust reasoning than just blindly scaling up monolithic, non-hierarchical models.
What a fascinating journey through this model. Okay, let's wrap up. This has been a really eye-opening deep dive. We've seen the hierarchical reasoning model achieve really impressive computational depth using this brain-inspired two-part architecture.
Yeah, and the key breakthroughs were things like hierarchical convergence, which uses that H module update as a reset to prevent stalling, solving a classic RNN problem.
Yeah.
And then the approximate gradient, based on DEQ theory and IFT, which cleverly sidesteps the crippling OT memory cost of BPTT, making deep recurrence practical with just over more memory.
And the payoff is significant. HRM, because it's recurrent and can run for arbitrary lengths, falls into the category of models that are theoretically Turing complete given enough time and memory. That's a fundamental step beyond the computational limits of standard fixed-depth transformers stuck in those lower complexity classes like AC dollars.
It really is, and it directly challenges the current AI paradigm, which seems heavily biased towards just making non-hierarchical models bigger and bigger, often relying on vast amounts of CoT data. HRM shows that maybe structure, hierarchy, and borrowing ideas from neuroscience are crucial ingredients for getting robust generalized reasoning, potentially more so than just parameter count alone.
Which leads perfectly to our final provocative thought. That observed dimensionality hierarchy, the fact that the high-level planning space spontaneously became almost 3 times larger, more complex than the execution space suggests something profound. Maybe the ability to truly reason and generalize isn't just about how many parameters you have, but how cleverly those parameters are organized maybe into these specialized multi-timescale systems to efficiently manage the inherently vast, high-dimensional nature of abstract thought itself. It shifts the focus from sheer scale to intelligent structure.
A beautiful way to put it. It's where neuroscience insights meet architectural innovation.
Thank you so much for walking us through the intricate details of HRM today. It's been incredibly insightful.
My pleasure. It was great discussing it.
And thank you, our listeners, for joining us on the deep dive. We'll be back soon with another exploration into the cutting edge of AI and technology.